Labour supports this bill. Labour supports any measure with an aim to prevent and mitigate the harm of domestic violence. However, Labour would say to this government that this bill is not ambitious enough for our children. Labour believes that this bill is not ambitious enough about protecting children who are the victims of domestic violence. And so while Labour supports this legislation, we believe that the government can and should be doing more to prevent and mitigate domestic violence. I'd like to share some statistics on domestic violence in New Zealand, Mr. Speaker, that highlights the point we're making, that the government can and should be doing more to prevent domestic violence. In 2008, police responded to about 83 incidences involving some form of domestic violence. 83,000. 4 to 10% of New Zealand children experience physical abuse. 24% of girls and 11% of boys experience sexual abuse. And in 2007, 6,400 children were involved in applications for protection orders. Most of these children witnessed violence. Some had been subjected to violence directly themselves. So New Zealand's domestic violence rates doesn't compare well with other OECD countries, and we have the worst child death by maltreatment rate in the world. A recent report commissioned by Every Child Counts found that child abuse and neglect in New Zealand cost around $2 billion per year. Now, these statistics, Mr. Speaker, would mean more to members of the House if one were to sit down and talk to children who are the victims of domestic violence. Yesterday, the Social Services Select Committee visited a local organisation that provides support, encouragement, counselling, and indeed love to a group of young men ranging from the ages of 12 to 19 years. Members of the committee heard firsthand the horrific stories of young children, one as young as 4 years old who was left to look after younger siblings, abandoned by their parents who were out on a drinking spree, left to fend for themselves with no food in the cupboards. We heard terrible stories and graphic details of how they were beaten up, sexually abused, or witnessed the degrading of their mother. And I apologise to the House in advance, but I'd like to share some of their stories of the lives of some of these children who are victims of domestic violence, just to make the point. One young man revealed how at night a wahine, as he describes it, would enter his bedroom and sexually abuse him. He prays to God for help. God does not answer him, and the abuse continues. This young man now hates God. Another said whenever his dad was drunk, he would have to sit on the laps of his dad's friends, and he would massage each of his father's friends. He was 6 years old. He hates his father, but he also needs him. Another young boy at 9 years old was raped by his mother's boyfriend. The boyfriend pushed his head into the mattress and said, I'm doing this to teach you to respect me. His mum doesn't want to know what happened. The boy wishes his dad were alive so he could do something about this guy. There were also stories of how these young children witnessed the degrading of their mothers. One boy described how his dad tried to kill his mum by pouring gasoline on her while they watched. Their mum is depressed and shuts them out now. Another boy described how his dad gave mum a beating and she was bleeding all over when he was only 4 years old. His father made him clean up all the blood. Another terrible story I heard yesterday was about a father who likes getting drunk and who beats up and forces his wife to prostitute. Whenever she finishes taking men, the father insists on knowing all the graphic details of what they did. One time, the father forces the mother to have sex with a dog while he watched. The young daughter who witnessed all this later in life became a prostitute herself and would beat up the men she was with. She ended up going too far and killed the man, and now she is in prison. Yet another story, just as horrible, is that of a 6-year-old who was beaten by his mother because she couldn't read, and when she played with matches, she was threatened with burning by having her hand held over a lit stove. At 7 years old, her father sold her so he could buy alcohol, and she was raped 40 times. I have recited these stories, Mr. Speaker, to underscore how important it is to be ambitious about protecting children from domestic violence and abuse. And these stories come from Māori, Pākehā, and Pacific kids. And I highlight that fact as there are many myths about domestic violence. When one reads letters in newspapers or blogs on the internet or listen to radio talkback shows, we hear a host of myths about domestic violence being regularly promoted. They include suggestions that only drunk or mentally ill men are violent. Others blame women for staying in abusive relationships or provoking the violence against them. The reality is that while some who perpetuate domestic violence are drunks, many are not. Some abusers are mentally ill, but many are not. Most of all, responsibility for abuse must lie with the person who is abusing others. No one ever deserves to be abused, struck, or beaten. One myth that has proven particularly stubborn to shift has been that which suggests domestic violence occurs in certain sectors of society and not in others. It is often suggested that domestic violence is something that only occurs in poor neighbourhoods or in Māori and Pacific families. However, as at least one high-profile domestic violence case in recent times has shown, men who physically abuse their partners and children come from all occupations, classes, religions and ethnicities. While domestic violence occurs in Māori, Pākehā and Asian and Pacific families, that does not mean that any one-size-fits-all approach is called for. Domestic violence, whether one is Pākehā or Pacifica, Māori or Asian, is never right. At a Pacific Champions of Change national whono earlier this year, the Governor-General made these remarks, and I quote, "Cultural norms can never be used as an excuse for violence, whether that be within the family or elsewhere. To those who would argue otherwise, I would respond that the tradition," and I place the words in quotes, "has either been twisted and misrepresented or simply has no place in New Zealand society." Using a supposed cultural norm as what can be described as a kind of fig leaf for domestic violence does more than just disempower victims. It attempts to co-opt the wider cultural and ethnic group into condoning violence and debases that culture's proud history and traditions, and as such, it brings shame on everyone. So back to my former point and where I began, I think, sir, what I've attempted to highlight here is that we've got a problem. It is a national problem. It needs to be a collective problem, and that is why we're supporting this particular bill. But I have to say to that side of the House that they need to reconsider and look further into the bill that the honourable senior members of the Labour Party introduced. That will give some indication to the Minister and the Government of how we can better improve this bill and to be ambitious about protecting our kids. And that is what we are strongly recommending to this Parliament at this time. Just finally, and I know that time is out, the Youth Law Tino Rangatiratanga made a submission which I want to simply highlight because it is significant and is something that we support. The bill needs to be amended, the definition of child within the Domestic Violence Act, to include young people under the age of 18. Finally, and I see that, that really brings us into line, sir, with the United Nations children's right, or the rights of the child, which I don't believe...
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. His time has expired.